I want to share a reading from Philip Zimbardo, who is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Stanford University, a professor at Palo Alto University, and the president of the Heroic Imagination Project. Some people argue humans are born good or born bad. I think that's nonsense. We are all born with this tremendous capacity to be anything, and we get shaped by our circumstances, by the family or the culture or the time period in which we happen to grow up, which are accidents of birth. Whether we grow up in a war zone versus peace, if we grow up in poverty rather than prosperity. George Bernard Shaw captured this point in the preface to his great play, Major Barbara. Every reasonable man and woman is a potential scoundrel and a potential good citizen. What a person is depends on their character, what's inside. What they do and what we think of what they do depends upon their circumstances. Each of us may possess the capacity to do terrible things, but we also possess an inner hero. If stirred to action, that inner hero is capable of performing tremendous goodness for others. A conclusion from my research is that few people do evil and fewer act heroically. Between these extremes in the bell curve of humanity are the masses, the general population who do nothing, who I call the reluctant heroes. Those who refuse the call to action and by doing nothing often implicitly support the perpetrators of evil. So on this bell curve of humanity, villains and heroes are the outliers. The reluctant heroes are the rest. And what heroic stories suggest is that every one of us can be a hero. A principal key of heroism is that heroes are most effective not alone, but in a network. It's through forming a network that people have the resources to bring their heroic impulses to life. My question, though, is DC or Marvel? It used to seem like a really silly question when I was a kid. I liked Batman, a DC Comics character. I liked Spider-Man, a Marvel Comics character. So it seemed like a both-and question, not an either-or. Why not DC and Marvel? Now, I'm not talking about movie franchises. Before the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the recent reboot of Batman and Zack Snyder's Justice League, these characters, these superheroes existed in serial comic books, things people would sit down and read. Every month, a new issue would come out and continue the story. They still exist, comic books. It's not all movies and Disney Plus series, but DC or Marvel? That question had more weight to it the more I read different stories, the more I met superheroes in the pages of comic books. It took a while for me to realize the difference. But DC and Marvel superheroes seemed to worry about different things. Maybe things have changed in more recent decades, but DC and Marvel superheroes had different challenges. I mean, categorically different. DC heroes. Batman was millionaire Bruce Wayne. He had emotional issues, trauma that led him to decide to become a superhero, but you really didn't see that psychological problem play out until more recent versions of the story. The biggest thing old school Batman had to worry about was his identity being revealed. Superman, another DC hero, he had to worry about his identity being revealed too, I guess. He went incognito as a meek reporter, but his real weakness was kryptonite, a mineral from his home planet, which is weird when I say it out loud, but it was external to him. He had internal moral struggles between whether to save one person or a whole bunch of people, but being Superman, he often found a way to do both. His real weakness was an external thing in his environment. Wonder Woman, DC hero. She was basically a demigod, but she chose to sublimate her power and adopt a secret identity. Getting a theme here? And as her alter ego, she had to deal with the way women are treated, an external challenge of her social environment. And DC Comics had some black superheroes as well. John Stewart was arguably one of the most effective Green Lanterns. But Marvel had a much more robust core of multicultural heroes. And this gets into problematic territory because white comic book writers authoring stories featuring black heroes inevitably perpetuates some false stereotypes, more than we can unpack today. And a lot of DC Comics heroes have changed in the past couple of decades. Their stories have become more nuanced. But they began as people who had very few, if any, flaws, but they struggled with things in their environment. Sexism, racism, being too rich, cosmic minerals. Despite all of that, they began as morally impeccable figures. They set an example. They did the right thing even when it was a challenge. Of course, they had a lot of resources that most people don't have. It was easier for them to make morally impeccable decisions that affected a large number of people. And they didn't really wrestle with a lot of internal challenges that most of us do. They were emotionally free to act on impeccable moral standards. And all of these stories evolved over time, of course, but one reason they've evolved is that people have realized that these heroes are problematic examples. We can't expect to be as powerful as these superheroes, and we can't expect to be as emotionally free of internal conflict, where the only real challenges in our lives come from outside of ourselves. They present a standard that we can't live up to. They teach us that when we're in trouble, when we're in a real crisis, someone more powerful will hopefully sweep in and save us. And Marvel heroes kind of taught us the same thing, that someone more powerful than we mere mortals could save us when life gets really bad. But Marvel heroes had a real distinction from DC heroes. They had serious character flaws sometimes. I mean, Spider-Man is just a kid, still naive about how the world works when he gains superpowers. Iron Man, Tony Stark, had a serious heart problem, but in some versions, he also wrestled with alcoholism, a lack of self-control, and arrogance that led him to create some of his worst enemies. And some Marvel heroes had physical challenges too. Daredevil was blind. Professor X, founder of the X-Men, was a paraplegic whose telepathic abilities could be overwhelmed by stronger psychic forces. And his relationship with Magneto wasn't cut and dried either. It had emotional depth and compassion and meaningful conflict about right and wrong. Marvel Comics, that I remember, wrestled with moral dilemmas and internal struggles. The heroes were in some ways more human. Black Panther's national pride was both a strength and a weakness, and so was Captain America's, for that matter. What does it mean when patriotism comes into conflict with morality? Very human struggles. We've required that of all of our heroes in the past few decades, I think. If our superheroes are going to be examples for us, we need to be able to see ourselves in them. We need to see that these figures wrestle with challenges and overcome them, not because they have superpowers, but because they have a deep sense of responsibility. That's what Spider-Man's Peter Parker learned from his Uncle Ben's dying words, right? With great power comes great responsibility. For Marvel heroes, at least, having a moral code comes with a deep commitment to face challenges and emerge from them stronger, and they don't always get it right. They are overcome with emotional struggles sometimes. They hurt the people they care about. They do all the things people do when we don't manage our anxiety well. They are relatable, but they're still heroes. They're still more than we can hope to be in some sense. They can shoot webs from their fingertips or read minds or blast lasers out of their eyes or just fly. They're superhuman. We can forgive ourselves if we don't slice through our problems with adamantine claws. We are only human. We have human vulnerabilities. We can forgive ourselves if we don't stand in front of out-of-control police when they're starting to get violent toward Black protesters. Ah, yes. There's another problem with our heroes. Our human heroes have disappointed us too. It only took a handful of police officers using excessive violence against unarmed Black men to eradicate trust in all police. And the numbers of incidents just keep climbing, which is a really painful thing to say out loud. It only takes a handful of soldiers committing wartime atrocities for us to suspect all soldiers of questionable morals. It only takes a handful of politicians using their office for personal gain for us to dismiss the entire political system as being corrupt and unreliable. And even as I say that, it feels like it's an exception when a politician doesn't use their position for personal gain. Our heroes have become problematic. There is no field in which people held in high esteem have not disappointed us. Actors, comedians, doctors, teachers, ministers. Our human heroes seem unable to overcome their human weaknesses sometimes, and we feel betrayed. And when we feel betrayed by one police officer, suddenly it feels like being betrayed by the entire profession. If our trust has been abused by one authority figure, all authority seems untrustworthy. Our heroes fail us. And so we have a new genre of story. The Umbrella Academy, The Boys, even some of the Marvel or DC movies and shows reflect a change in how we perceive heroes. They aren't just flawed like us. Now we see people with superpowers expressing flaws in proportion to their power. In some stories, the people with powers are the worst of what humanity has to offer because we don't trust power the way we might have at some point. We don't trust our heroes. We don't trust our exemplars. We've seen and experienced enough to know that they'll disappoint us. We suspect a very harsh truth. No one is coming to save us. The world that our forebears created, that we continue to co-create, is fraught with hardship and moral challenges. Some of us benefit from a system that directly hurts others, and we feel helpless to do anything about it, even if we wanted to, because it's so much bigger than us. We have mammoth challenges in the racism that still exists in our city and our nation and our world. We just barely kept at least 4 anti-transgender bills from getting a vote in this year's Texas legislative session. And there are proposals all over the country trying to keep lesbian and gay couples from adopting children, trying to dehumanize people who are transgender and limit their rights. And even with all of our efforts, in this legislative session, an anti-choice bill passed that could have devastating consequences for women. We have people in this city losing their homes because of the economic impact of a poorly handled pandemic, and landlords who are desperately trying to preserve their own well-being and can't afford to house people for free. We want to paint them as villains sometimes, but they're human beings wrestling with moral dilemmas too. We can see some short-term relief happening in some of these areas, but the system that created these issues still exists. And no one is going to fly in and fix it for us. We might have missed the point of some of these stories about superheroes. The more recent ones are cautionary tales born out of our disenfranchisement and disillusionment, but those earlier stories weren't intended to be completely removed from human experience. Those heroes were meant to teach us something about ourselves, about who we can aspire to be. We might get distracted by laser beam eyes and psychic powers and web slinging and fancy gadgets we could never afford or create, but that's not really the point of those stories. There are people who are doing something worthy of our attention in the real world, though. There are heroic stories happening all around us, not in comic books and movies, right around us. Chef Q Ibrahim almost lost her business in the early days of the pandemic, but she turned her upscale catering business into a farm-to-table enterprise that taught young people about urban agriculture and cooking while addressing the food insecurity that so many families have been experiencing. Through her program, over 60,000 meals have been prepared for over 600 people that would have gone without in the past year. That's heroic. Hector Guadalupe spent 10 years in prison for drug trafficking, and he had a hard time as a returning citizen, even though he had worked to be certified as a personal trainer. But he didn't give up. And when he landed a job, he worked hard not only to establish a future for himself, but to build a program that would help other returning citizens. He assembled a team of volunteers to run an intense, free 8-week program that prepares students for a national certification exam. And in the past 5 years, more than 200 people have graduated from his program, and only 2 have reoffended. That's a less than 1% recidivism rate. That's heroic. When 6 California firefighters lost their homes while battling wildfires, a grateful local resident provided RVs for them while they were rebuilding. That's heroic. When COVID-19 hit, a hero in New Jersey turned his newspaper delivery route into a lifeline for senior citizens by offering to deliver their groceries and household goods to the 450 people along his route. That is heroic. If you remember Hurricane Harvey at all, you remember that people in Houston stepped up and helped neighbors and strangers caught in floodwaters any way they could. Our own neighbors across the street from us provided for us when the freeze knocked out our electricity and water this past spring. You don't have to look very far to find stories about people being heroic. None of those people are perfect, but that's not a requirement. You have been heroic, whether you're willing to own that about yourself or not. Our old stories of heroes were meant to teach us something about ourselves, that we are capable of wrestling with difficult issues and growing, that it isn't weakness when we need one another to accomplish something worthy of our care and attention, that we are still worthy of love and acceptance even when we get it wrong and we have to clean up some big messes in our lives, that we are capable of acting with bold integrity to values that really matter. We don't need a vibranium shield or an invisible jet to do something meaningful in our lives. We can nurture the world around us toward wholeness and well-being without superpowers. We have to. If we want to live into a vision of justice and equity and compassion, we have to build that reality without superpowers. And no one is going to build that reality for us. We might have partners in that work. We do have partners in that work. But affirming and promoting a global community with peace and liberty and justice for every person means that we do that work of creation. It doesn't mean that we sit back and point and tell other people what they need to do to fulfill our vision. It means that we make that vision reality in whatever ways we can, in partnership with one another. We are the heroes in this scenario. Not because we have something normal mortal people don't have, but because we have all of the resources of human beings able to act in community with integrity to a vision of wholeness. That's what we've been doing here for the past couple of years. That's what Tapestry has hopefully been preparing us for. Heroic action, which is to say, intentional action that reflects what we most deeply care about. Intentional action that reflects a bold vision for what the world can be. You were heroic in your actions with You the Vote. We're going to need that heroism again in the next few years. You were heroic in your support of the Montrose Center's efforts to provide shelter for LGBTQ young people who are without a home. There's going to be more opportunity for that kind of heroism. You've been heroic just in connecting with one another and developing a resilient spiritual community in a time when community has been particularly challenging. But maybe there are things you're holding back on. Maybe there are actions you're hesitant to take. Maybe there's something you want to speak up about, something almost worth traveling to Austin or even Washington or getting in front of a representative about. maybe just talking to your school board. School boards are tremendously powerful, but you're not sure you're the one to do it. You think there might be someone or some group of someones who will swoop in and take care of it so you don't have to. You're only human after all. I've got to tell you, you are that someone. You are that community of someones who are called to take bold action and build a world that is just, equitable, and compassionate. You are not just human. You are fully human, and you can bring all that you are into the work of healing and affirming and connecting and building and modeling for others what it looks like to live into a vision of wholeness. Just like all of those superheroes were supposed to be modeling for us what it looks like to be morally impeccable in our choices, you can model for the people around you what it looks like to be multicultural, anti-racist, identity-affirming people who own their responsibility to act in accordance with our shared principles as a community in partnership with other communities. You won't always get it right. You'll wrestle with internal emotional challenges. You'll wrestle with external, environmental, and social challenges. But that's what heroes do. And you will never have to face those challenges alone. Maybe one of you will offer a sermon in the year ahead about how often hero stories are about partnership and cooperation. That's a whole topic in itself. But you have community, a powerful community of heroic people. So may you live into your heroic identity with compassion and purpose. Amen, and blessed be.